What players do you think of when you hear the phrase empty stats? Maybe it's big men who fell victim to modern analytics, Hassan Whiteside, Enes Kanter, Andre Drummond. Maybe it's volume scorers on bad teams like Andrew Wiggins on the Minnesota Timberwolves or Devin Booker before Chris Paul got there, maybe Carmelo Anthony. Or maybe you're thinking further back, Corey Maggette, Mike James, etc. There really isn't a formal definition for empty stats, but usually players are labeled as collecting empty stats when their counting stats are an overrepresentation of their skills in some way. Whether that be a lot of points on bad efficiency, or putting up a lot of stats without positively impacting the game for your team. Empty stats players inflate their numbers while being a detriment to team success. But is it fair to label players as collecting empty stats? I mean, let's think about the Wizards this year, for example. If Jordan Poole averages 28 points per game, shooting 41% from the field, is that his fault? The team doesn't have a lot of talented shot creators, so someone has to do it, right? And for younger players on bad teams, where's the line between developing your game and collecting these empty stats? Can a stat ever really be empty? Well, let's talk about it. What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Sports Ball Network. I just want to say really quickly that my co-host and I are working really hard on pumping out entertaining content for the channel, so a like and a subscription would be very much appreciated. Now let's get into the video. Let's start this analysis with Devin Booker. Today we see Booker as a star player, easily top 25 in the NBA and a perennial all-star. But many of his critics painted him with the empty stats label before his time in the bubble. In Booker's first 4 seasons, the Suns were consistently atrocious. 23 wins in 2016, 24 in 2017, hey, improvement, 21 and 61 in 2018, and a brutal 19 wins in 2019. Yeah, he went a combined 87 and 241 in his first 4 seasons. But let's put some context to this. 2016 was his age 19 season. You may be saying, but this team won 39 games the previous year, and they really only lost Goran Dragic. Did Devin Booker tank them by that many wins? Well, I'd also say no to that. That team struggled to stay healthy all season, and besides Booker, their top players were Eric Bledsoe and Brandon Knight. Plus, like I said, this dude was 19 years old. He's still years, plural years, away from drinking a beer, at least in the United States. He averaged about 14 points per night on subpar 42-34 splits, but it's not uncommon for rookie guards to struggle with efficiency. Chris Paul, De'Aaron Fox, and many more have followed a similar path to this. Booker continued struggling with his efficiency the next 2 seasons as the Suns continued to lose games. He shot 42.3% from the field in 2017 and 43.2% from the field in 2018, but scored 22 points and almost 25 points per game respectively. In 2019, Booker finally fixed his efficiency, 26.6 points and 6.8 assists per game on 46.7% from the field. Yet, Booker was still labeled as an empty stats player because his team, which mind you had not been talented at all, continued to lose games. This shows the main overarching justification for empty stats: lack of team success from a volume scorer. Let's compare those 2019 numbers to his 2021-2022 season, in which he was an all-star, all-NBA player, and a consensus top player in the league. In 2022, he averaged 0.2 more points, 2 less assists, the same amount of minutes, and a slightly better 3-point percentage. So what changed? Why is he perceived as so much better now? After an 8-0 finish in the bubble in 2020, the Suns realized Devin Booker had become a star. This was the time to win now, so they made a blockbuster move to trade for Chris Paul. This was an instant success for the Suns, as in his first season, the Suns went 51-21 and made the NBA Finals. From this point onward, Devin Booker was seen as a top player in the NBA. So you start to win games, and even with the same stats, you lose that label of empty stats. But was Devin Booker ever actually even an empty stats player? I'd say no. When he was younger, he had some truly terrible teams around him. He struggled with efficiency for his first few years, but that's nothing unorthodox for a young guard. From the age of 20, he was the best scorer on his team, so he took a lot of shots and defenses focused on him. This allowed him to develop, and when he finally got some team help, he was able to lead a team deep into the playoffs. Let's look at another example of someone who was deemed as an empty stats player by the NBA community a few years ago, but has since turned his career around. Andrew Wiggins was drafted with the first overall pick back in 2014. He was seen as a generational prospect, earning the nicknames of Maple Jordan and Air Canada. Like every single amazing college prospect, he was seen as the best prospect since LeBron. He was technically selected by the Cavaliers, but traded to the Timberwolves shortly after in exchange for Kevin Love. The Timberwolves were stuck in mediocrity with Kevin Love as their superstar, so they decided to hit the rebuild button with this move. So now Andrew Wiggins was the face of this Minnesota franchise, and they'd allow him to have his growing pains. In his first 3 seasons, his scoring average would go from 16.9 to 20.7, and then all the way up to 23.6 points per game in 2017. In that season, the Timberwolves would only win 31 games, despite their extremely talented young core of Zach LaVine, Cat, and Andrew Wiggins, all putting up pretty gaudy scoring numbers. Funnily enough, all 3 of these guys have been called empty stats players at some point in their careers. Fans and players alike understood Wiggins was not really a 25 point per game caliber guy, at least at this point in his career. Despite his 23.6 points per game in 2017, he was behind players like Trevor Ariza, Derek Favors, and Wilson Chandler in All-Star voting, despite much less impressive stat lines on the surface. Andrew Wiggins' time in Minnesota and Devin Booker's early years on the Suns show us another main reason for calling someone an empty stats player: volume scorers with bad efficiency. Specifically someone whose primary value added to a team is their scoring, but still they do this inefficiently. Let's take a look at those 2017 stats. 45% from the field, only 4 rebounds per game for a 6'7" guy playing 37 minutes, and as many assists as turnovers. It should also be noted he wasn't even a willing defender at this point in his career, despite having the tools to be. In 2018, the Timberwolves acquired Jimmy Butler, and the Timberwolves would make the playoffs. Jimmy Butler has about the exact opposite story as Andrew Wiggins. Late first rounder, barely any PT in his early seasons, but he still found an avenue to become a superstar. You'd think an influence like that in the locker room would help Wiggins improve, yet he crumbled in that season. Not only did his scoring output drop to 17.7 points per game, his efficiency took a nosedive too. Wiggins did not take his relegation from the top scoring option very well. The next season, Jimmy would ask out from the Timberwolves, opening up the top dog spot once again. But in this season, Cat took advantage and became the number 1 option on the Timberwolves. Wiggins only got his scoring average up to 18 points per game and was still doing it on bottom of the barrel efficiency. At this point, he wasn't even putting up empty stats, he was just playing bad. But once again, Wiggins was able to change the narrative. After getting traded to Golden State, he switched up his game. He realized maybe he wasn't built to be a 25 point per game scorer in the NBA, and especially not on a team with Steph, Clay, and Poole. So he began committing on the defensive end, working on his 3-point shot, and improving his shot selection. Despite his counting stats being similar to his rookie year, and far below his 2017 numbers, he earned an All-Star appearance in 2022 as a starter as well. On top of this, the Warriors would win an NBA championship, with many arguing Wiggins was the second best player on the team. Wiggins found his role in the NBA, and shook off the title of being an empty stats player. He was an empty stats player in Minnesota, but he flipped the script. Now let's look at someone who never exactly escaped the empty stats narrative: Andre Drummond. Drummond was treated like a star for his first 8 or so years in the league. He got a damn max contract from the Pistons, and his numbers popped out of the screen for sure. 15, 16, 17 points per game in seasons, several seasons over 14 rebounds per game. He was a 2-time All-Star and an All-NBA player, but he wasn't impacting the game in the way his stats make you think he did. He was putting up these monster numbers, yet the Pistons were consistently under 500. They only made the playoffs twice in his career there. In their first playoff appearance in 2016, Reggie Jackson and Tobias Harris were more impactful players than Drummond according to Box Plus Minus. Drummond had just a 1.1 Box Plus Minus despite averaging 16 points and 15 rebounds, while Reggie had a 2.7 and Tobias Harris had a 3.1. Yet Andre Drummond was their only All-Star this season. In 2019, they'd make the playoffs again, but that's because Blake Griffin legit had an MVP caliber season just to drag that team to a 500 record. I also have to mention, it's not like Drummond was some elite defender. If a guy like Rudy Gobert is averaging 15 and 15 but a DPOY level defender, that's a totally different story. If you're being kind, you could say he was an average defender. He had very active hands for steals, but he would get bodied by other centers in the paint way too often, and it never looked like he was giving complete effort on the court. Since his Detroit days, he's bounced from team to team and has had his role decrease steadily. But if you look at his number, he's still scoring and rebounding at a similar clip to his prime. So why isn't he an All-Star anymore? Well, people realized he isn't adding much value to a team. He gets a lot of defensive rebounds, but mostly uncontested ones. He gets some offensive board, but often off his own missed shot. And he doesn't even have a great field goal percentage for a center, plus his free throw shooting is atrocious. He's consistently been near the bottom for points per possession, which is crazy for an interior-oriented big man, and everyone has seen his tragic Bronson moments on Shaqtin' a Fool. Add on to that his bad defense, and to be honest, he's doing more harm for a team than good when he's on the court. This shows another overarching reason for calling somebody an empty stats player. A player whose style of play doesn't lead to wins. His style of play fell out of favor in the NBA for more skilled, efficient players, and hence his prime is now just an anecdote to an empty stats player. Next, let's talk about an extremely polarizing player, an all-time great to some people and an empty stats player to others. He was extremely talented, no doubt. He inspired a generation of basketball fans, and personally, he's one of my favorite players of all time. Carmelo Anthony, Hoodie Melo, OG Melo, whatever you want to call him. Throughout his career, Melo was a certified bucket. He wasn't the most efficient scorer per se, but he came in when guys like Jordan just retired and Kobe was entering his prime. The mid-range game was alive and well. Melo was one of the most talented scorers in NBA history, some of the best footwork, one of the cleanest jumpers the NBA has ever seen. He even won a scoring title in his career. But he failed to impact team success in the same way other superstars did. But he's not your typical empty stats player. Devin Booker, Andre Drummond, Andrew Wiggins, these guys typically commandeered bad teams and only made the playoffs with another star player. But Melo consistently brought the Nuggets to the playoffs in the 2000s and the Knicks in his first 3 years there in the 2010s. But in the playoffs, he often faltered. On top of the previous reason of his style of play falling out of favor in the 2010s and being kind of inefficient, this brings us to the last overarching justification for calling someone an empty stats player: lack of playoff success. His scoring helped lead some teams to wins in the regular season, but since it didn't hold up in the playoffs, some people made that decision to call him an empty stats player. As the Knicks started to miss the playoffs in the mid-2010s, this noise only grew louder. Make sure to tune in to one of the channel's next off-season videos where I take a deep dive into the polarizing career of Carmelo Anthony. To me, he definitely wasn't an empty stats player in Denver, but as he got older and those Knicks teams got less talented, he definitely started to put up some empty stats. More so though, he was a star whose game didn't translate well to when defenses turned up in the playoffs, a la Joel Embiid. Anyways, one bonus example to note is someone who definitely wasn't a bad player. In fact, even won an MVP in this season. Yeah, I'm talking about post-Kevin Durant Russ. You may be thinking this guy averaged 30, 10, and 10. How does he fit the definition of empty stats we've been talking about all video? I've shown that empty stats players don't have to be bad, or even on bad teams. The 2017 Thunder were a decent team, but it almost felt like their team mission was to get Russ to his triple-double average. I swear Steven Adams might be the nicest guy in basketball because the number of times I saw him box out so Russ could get an uncontested rebound was unreal. And off a pass from Russ, I feel like anybody on that Thunder team would have shot the rock. Oh yeah, and he himself shot 24 times per game on efficiency that was decent at best. And look, I get it, this guy was amazing, he won the MVP, but I think we all agree some level of stat padding took place in that season. And the definition of stat padding means that you're inflating your numbers. He was a volume scorer with bad efficiency, who had his rebounding numbers and assist numbers heavily inflated. That is, in some ways, the definition of an empty stats player. But let's revisit the original question. What are empty stats? Does this phenomenon exist? After all this analysis, yes and no. It really is a subjective term. When a team is bad, a player has to take the shots. These are the most common types of empty stat players. These are the Terry Rozier, Jalen Green, Jordan Poole next year type of players. It doesn't mean these players are bad, but they're forced to do something that requires more talent than they currently have. But it's difficult to call them empty stats players if you know their counting stats are the product of bad offenses where someone has to take the shots. This is especially true when it's a young guard or ball handler at the helm of a team. A lottery pick guard is often given the keys to an otherwise subpar team. They're gonna fight through inefficiency, but they can become stars, like a Devin Booker. Then again, there are a lot of guys who just take time to develop too. Giannis took years to develop from a raw prospect to a superstar. Some things just take time to work out. The real life NBA is not like 2K. Progression isn't linear and it doesn't always happen as you'd expect it to. But sometimes it still doesn't work out for a player. Even after many years of the volume scoring role, for example, Andrew Wiggins on the Timberwolves, 5.5 years, and he never developed into a go-to number one option. He moved to the Warriors, and in a new situation, he found his role as one of the best supporting pieces in the league. A guy who can shoot, a guy who can defend, and every once in a while can create some offense. He put up some empty stats as the number 1 guy, but found a more suitable role for his skill set. And then there are the empty stats players that kind of deserve the label. In my opinion, these are the players who've been in the NBA a while, continue to be inefficient, and don't positively impact a team's ability to win games. This is the Andre Drummond, Enes Kanter, and depending on your opinion, the Carmelo Anthony tier of players. For Drummond and Kanter, these guys could score inside pretty well, grabbed a lot of uncontested rebounds or offensive rebounds off their own missed shots, but they were turnstiles on defense and couldn't really do anything else on the court. They were negatives on the court, and it's unsurprising they struggled to find team success. And for Melo, his mid-range scoring lethality had some success, but was often stymied in the playoffs, so he never reached the level of a top 5 player in the NBA. His stats weren't empty for most of his career, but the game changed around him like it did with Drummond and Kanter. The mid-range was a dying art as modern analytics pointed out its inefficiency compared to the inside shot or the three-point shot. His archetype was no longer a hot commodity in the 2010s NBA, so post-Nuggets tenure, he's labeled as an empty stats player. But what do you guys think? Do you think the term empty stats makes sense to use with some players? Also, let me know any other videos you want to see in the comments section down below. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, and that's it for this video. Bye bye!